Okay, so yeah, basically, if you ever move your mic, if you make noises, if the phone rings, if anything happens, it really doesn't matter.
Okay.
It never does.
Okay.
I find people make a big stink of those things.
Yeah.
Who cares?
We live in a world of imperfect content now.
Well, if people want content fast and they want it free
Yeah.
and they want it every week,
Yeah.
you're going to have to suffer through this.
Yeah.
Come on.
That makes sense. How long have you been doing the podcast?
I've been doing it for 2 years.
Okay. Weekly for 2 years.
I did it on the radio last year.
Okay.
For 2 seasons as well.
Okay.
And recently, I just started getting into video.
Okay.
Because I have a studio. I've been
Yeah,
here for
you might
6
as well.
years.
You
But
might as well.
it was very easy at first to just do it audio.
Right.
Also, people are very, they're less guarded. You know,
Really? Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
it's a lot of
When there's-
pressure. Now there's lights, there's cameras. It's like,
yeah, that makes sense.
you know, especially women have told me, you know, like some bigger artists were like, is there gonna be a makeup artist? And then I'm like,
Oh, wow.
okay, like it's not what you think it is.
Yeah.
Like we're not
Yeah.
on TV.
Yeah. Yeah.
Habib,
Yes.
nice to finally meet you.
Likewise, man. This has been not too long in the making, but
Not
we
too
missed
long in
each
the
other.
making.
We missed each other last trip.
It's fine by me. I think there was a timing thing, and when things happen the way they happen, it's meant to be.
Yeah.
Habib, you are a stand-up comedian.
I got nervous when you said that for whatever reason. I was like, oh man, I really am, huh?
Also, you hold the distinction to be the first stand-up comic that I'm getting on the show.
Oh no way, that's awesome.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
At first, I was very self-conscious of
Yeah.
staying in my lane.
Yeah.
Artists, musicians is
Yeah.
what I know.
Yeah.
Gradually opening it up to different kinds of artists.
Yeah.
And for sure, I was thinking stand-up, but to be honest with you, I don't necessarily feel that every stand-up comic is funny.
Well, that's true.
You know what I
I
mean?
guess.
Like,
I mean,
that's
don't
not-
ask me.
No,
Let's
no.
not open that.
But the same way that I don't feel some musicians, I'm not so into what they're doing.
Yeah, no, I
You know.
agree with that. Well, hopefully I don't mess it up for the rest of the comics.
Hopefully you don't disappoint,
let's slam this door shut on comedy. Can I curse? I'm okay to curse. I mean, I don't
100%.
curse heavily, but I'll also self-edit.
100%.
Okay.
You are a comedian that was doing a show in Montreal in the end of May.
Yeah.
And this is dans le cadre de Pop Montréal.
Yes.
And I'm going to read to people the description of the event. It was a 75-minute special about home, identity, and spending a little too much time in the woods. Habib revisits the recent events in Lebanon, the accompanying sense of loss, and the difficulties trying to exist in two worlds, here and there, whose realities stand in such contrast. This is a show where grief meets laughter, and a portion of the proceeds will go to support live comedy in Lebanon. While naturally being who I am,
Who are you?
that's for another episode. It's it really struck me as here's how it happened for me. I didn't even hesitate. I clicked on your name. I sent you a DM.
Yeah.
And I said, I have a podcast. I'd love you to come and give you that space. Do you want to come? Immediately you replied,
Yeah.
let's do this.
Yeah, because honestly, man, as a, I don't know what your experience. I think everybody has a different experience and trajectory in life, but specifically, I mean, as an artist, it's already. I think I've been doing comedy about 8 years, pandemic included, and I think this is the first year I call it and treat it as art. You know, I've never considered myself an artist. I didn't grow up like we were talking about this earlier, like I'm 43. I started comedy at 35. I'm a dinosaur in comedy years. You know, that was a very interesting first few years because I'm the age, like when I started at 35, 36, 37, I was the age of headlining comics. But I was hanging around with open mic comics who were 18, 19, and 20.
Yeah, how did that feel?
And it was difficult to relate, man. It was very difficult to relate just on an experiential level, on a personal level. A lot of very talented and very welcoming comics and people. But as a 35-year-old, it is a bit more difficult to connect with a 20-year-old. I mean, I think that's normal.
I feel that same way when I think of where I'm at in the pyramid of music in Montreal. You know, I struggle. I fight this feeling of being 35 and
Yeah.
being with those like younger people.
Yeah.
And having said that, I can only give you your props, man, for like.
Oh, I appreciate that, man. But all of that to say was my trajectory in comedy has felt very lonely at times. I would have loved, like, there are certain moments where I felt very unsupported, and so anytime somebody reaches out and shows any kind of interest or any willingness, to collaborate or speak or, whatever
space.
it is, give me space, a platform, an opportunity of any kind, I'm usually very receptive to that because in my experience, at least, I'm not going to make this a blanket statement on the state of comedy. Comedy is very lonely. No,
You
it's
came here
not.
to speak for comedy.
I came here to speak for me. I actually, as a comic, am generally I feel like I'm on the outskirts a little bit. I don't usually hang out at shows very much when I'm done. Part of that is just I don't drink. I'm not a nightlife person, which is very weird to be doing comedy
Right.
if you're not like a night owl. And also for the longest of times, until about a year and a half ago, I was always doing comedy with a full-time job. And it was a serious, like I've had demanding jobs.
Right.
And so just didn't always have the opportunity to hang out, and kind of kick it. So was always looked at as a bit of an outsider.
Yeah, you do notice that it does help people who do hang around, people who
Yeah.
do blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Having said all that, so yeah, thank you for coming.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It means a lot to me. And so could you please, before we get to the show, before we
Yeah.
even get to that part of it,
Yeah.
I want to know about you. I want to know about your life. I want to know about your trajectory. I want to know how you grew up. Where did you grow up?
I grew up everywhere, man.
Please tell me.
I won't do the rundown. I won't do the rundown of countries.
Whatever you want.
But my father used to work in foreign affairs. So every 4 years, every roughly 3 to 4 years, we would move countries.
Okay, whoa.
And it was a very even mix, I would say. Maybe not that even, like mostly Middle Eastern countries, but I grew up in the States for a chunk of time.
Okay.
So Lebanon, the States, back to Lebanon, a couple of countries in the Gulf, Qatar and the UAE, back to Lebanon for university. And then I moved back to North America after my undergrad.
Okay.
So I was 22. I went to the States for a year for an internship and then moved up to Canada when I was 23 for my master's.
In Toronto?
Initially here, I did a year here in Montreal because I was missing a few credits, and then I didn't get into McGill.
Okay.
I got into Ottawa U though, and so I went to Ottawa and did my master's there. I graduated the summer of 06. And my Canadian experience was always meant to be short term. I came here for my graduate degree, and I studied psychology. And my master's was in counseling, and I used to work in substance abuse rehab.
Wow.
Right? And
Wow.
the goal was always to go back to Lebanon and start like a treatment center there or work in that field in Lebanon. But in the summer of 06, war broke out in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And I wasn't able to go back. Like there was no airport to fly into, just the conditions.
Which was the year that you finished your studies?
Yeah, I finished, like the war started July 12. My last course, my last like class or credit or when I wrapped everything up was probably July 6th.
Wow.
So literally 6 days. I went on a camping trip with a bunch of friends just to celebrate. We went out to like Cape Breton and I was out of cell signal for like 3 days. And when I came back, it was still flip-top phone errors.
Yeah, sure.
But when I came out, I literally had like 36 text messages and about 22 voicemails. And I'm not that type of dude, man. 3 days, that's a lot.
Yeah, sure.
And it was all my family just being like, yo, where the hell are you? Like, do you know what's going on? And I didn't have like the internet to check. So I had to wait for 3 hours until we got back to my friend's place. And I literally ran to the computer and I just like, I needed to see, I needed a visual. And I remember having like a complete breakdown, man. I had a complete like meltdown and just sobbing in front of a computer screen. In somebody's house that I ostensibly didn't know, like my friend, yes, but I don't know her parents.
Right. Yeah.
And so I couldn't go back. I got offered like a 3-year contract at Ottawa U. Kind of signed that. Got my work permit, and then applied for immigration because I just didn't want to be in a position where I couldn't go back home, and I wouldn't say I wasn't welcome to stay in my host country, but my study permit was expiring July 31st. So I was like in a situation where I was in a race against time, you know, like I literally had 2.5 weeks to sort out how I was going to stay in Canada. Do I think I would have gotten deported? No. But it is
No, but still,
stressful, man.
yeah.
It's stressful to be in those offices and to get, jerked around from person to person and getting conflicting information and not knowing, and with stakes that are as high as they were.
I think people who don't experience that can't really understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I've been in that situation with less like stressful conditions in terms of, oh, I'm waiting on a study permit. If I don't get it, I can't go get my degree.
Yeah.
Or I have to push that back. And that is a bit of stress, but it's very different than, my home is at war and I can't go back and I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have very much time to figure it out. So ended up staying here. And then what was supposed to be a 2 to 3 year Canadian experience is now on year like 2021, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
I've been here 2 decades.
That's that puts it in perspective.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of detours along the way. Worked for a bit, went back after Ottawa. I came back to Montreal to get my Ph.D. at McGill. Ironically, they didn't let me into the masters, but they
They let you a level below.
I came back for the Ph.D. And then I think I graduated in 2013. And that first year post graduation was one of the toughest in my life.
Okay.
I wasn't able to get a job. And as time went on, I went through a very difficult breakup, and professionally was just not able to get a job. And so 2 months in, 4 months in, 6 months in, then you start reassessing some of your decisions. You're like, what did I do with this degree?
Mm-hmm.
And then about I'd say almost a year removed from graduation, having gotten 2 job interviews out of 200 applications, I had to take a step back, and I was like, okay, I know what I'm chasing.
Mm-hmm.
What do I want to do? Because I got to the point where I'm applying for jobs, and on some level internally, I was like, I hope I don't get this. I need it financially, but I know I'm going to be miserable doing this.
Okay.
This is not what I worked for.
You actually had to have that conversation with yourself at some point?
Yes, I had to figure out, because asking myself at 35, what would you want to do in life? I gave myself almost like an ideal scenario, right? A utopic scenario. I was like, no bills, no responsibilities.
What do I want?
What do I want? In an ideal world, what would I do? And I couldn't answer that question. And I realized that for however long, I knew what I was supposed to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I was supposed to go to school and then university and then graduate school. And I think that had been placed on me because I think my father's the first person in the family to go to college.
Wow.
So for my grandmother, growing up, it was always education, education, education. And that kind of got instilled in me. I never took the time to weigh out any alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, around then, I was like, hey, I love speaking to people. I love radio. I'm not ready to jump into that world, but maybe I can do a quick podcast series.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that. I collaborated with a very talented photographer called Tron, who's still active in the city.
Solid name.
Oh, man, amazing name and amazing person, really, and a fantastic photographer. I learned so much working with him. I'm very grateful for the time that I got to spend with him and to see how invested he was in the project as well, right? Because a lot of times you work with people that, don't carry their weight or are just doing it because it's a paycheck or whatever. Yeah. And I collaborated with Off the Hook, basically.
Yeah.
At the time, Tron was one of the photographers at OTH, and I collaborated with them just for dissemination. I wanted a platform to to air it on. It was a sneaker podcast. Talked to some very interesting people in the city, and I wanted to start comedy. I wanted to try comedy. It was something that I'd kind of been curious about for a while. And then literally one day in I think it was end of October 2014, I emailed a bunch of like venues here.
Okay.
I just like Googled, open mic comedy, whatever it was. I can't remember what I Googled. I got like 4 or 5 like numbers and emails online, and I just, shot off a few emails, made a few
Really?
calls. Yeah. And then out of nowhere, like I can't remember exactly when, but I know it was a Sunday. I get a call and some dude was like, "Hey, it's Jason Hattrick from the Comedy Nest." And I was like, "Yeah, and?"
Pray tell.
And he was like, "Yeah." He was like, "You wrote in for a spot." Dude, I was so high that I forgot. Like
Wow.
I was just completely in. I was so depressed and just so overwhelmed, and like my brain just wasn't sharp. And he was like, "Hey, you got a spot on Wednesday." I was like Wednesday in 3 days? And they were like, "Yeah, in 3 days." And it's 5 minutes.
Oof.
And I almost, because I'd never been on stage, it's not like this is something that I was working up to where I
Okay.
had material. I had nothing.
Okay.
3 days prior to my first comedy set, I had nothing prepared or written. And there was a part of me that almost jumped in and was like, "Can we push it back a week just so I have like a 10-day?"
Fair enough.
But then my I don't know what it was, man. Something kicked in and was like, if you do that, you're going to bail.
Yeah.
If you give yourself 10 days, first of all, if you give yourself 10 days, you probably won't start writing until next Sunday.
So what's the point?
So what's the point?
Yeah.
So I went ahead and did it, and I just hit the ground running, man. Like a lot of people that I've spoken to ease into things.
Yep.
I did that first set. I got off stage and I was like, this is it. I felt so comfortable. I went out and I cried. Like
Really?
I cried because it was such an emotional release. I was like, wow, what is this? And I was like, I just want to do this with no expectations. Is that I just wanted to do it for the sake of doing it. I wasn't like, yo, I want to do this so I can become famous or so I can get a special or so I was like, I just want to get good at this. I want to get as good as I can. And I gave myself a year.
Okay.
I was like, just do it for a year, see where it goes, So I started taking like contracts here and there, translating for CBC, teaching at McGill, whatever it was, and just doing comedy. And I kept getting better and better and better. And about 2 years in, I got a job in Toronto, and I was like, I'm not ready to leave, but also I have a job offer.
Yeah.
Like it'll help a lot.
I gotta pay my bills.
Toronto's expensive. It's a full-time job. Let me go see what's up. First year was so rough, I almost quit comedy. It's a very different scene. It's much bigger. Here you have like maybe 30, 40 active comics.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a rough estimate. But I would say in Toronto, you're looking at least 10 times that. 400, I would say, between people that are doing open mics, middles, headliners, independent, whatever. It's a big scene. It's big distances to travel. There was a level of shows that I'd never experienced here. Like open mics here, you'll still have audience. People are supportive. Over there, you're waiting 2 hours to do 5 minutes in front of no one.
Right.
In front of literally nobody. Maybe a few comics that are waiting their turn if you're lucky.
I understand completely. Habib, I should also come clean at this point in the podcast that I stayed in Brampton for 3 years.
Oh, wow.
So
It is some of my most fun shows in that city, man.
because people need to laugh, bro, because it's a dark place.
Yeah. And so from there, man, after that first year, once I got a little bit of traction, it's been a very interesting kind of trajectory. I got fired from what I thought was my career job, what I thought was my legacy job.
Oh, really?
I got fired from that like a few months into the lockdown.
Ah,
Yeah. I got fired from the job I moved to Toronto for, I should say, about 2 months in.
right.
And that created another, like, what do I do? Like, crisis. I got this other job, which I was at for 3 years. And it got to a point just before the lockdown where I was like, yeah, I don't think I can juggle comedy and the job anymore.
Right, because it's at night. You're doing comedy at night.
I'm doing comedy at night, but it got to the point where I started headlining clubs and I was starting to travel for comedy. So I was going to Halifax. It was still like within Canada. But I was doing things like working long hours, like Monday through Thursday, hopping on a plane Friday morning to go to Halifax,
Right.
do 2 shows, come back on the Sunday, take more meetings on Monday, drive to Brampton for a show, go to Niagara, you're covering distances. It's not
Yeah,
just show
especially
up.
Canada.
Yeah. So coming out of the pandemic, I was like, yeah, I'd like to try this full time.
Can I ask you, like, for real, like, why comedy? who were you looking up to? Who was comedy in your head? What was comedy? What made you feel you wanted to do this?
I've loved comedy since I was a kid. Although my earliest memories were not necessarily stand-up, as much as TV shows, mostly TV shows. And then I think my most formative, I did at theater when I was a kid a little bit. Like, and by a kid, I literally mean like eight years old.
Okay, a child.
A child. And it was, I went to French school and we did Molière, which is Le Malade Imaginaire. And so I started reading a lot of like comedy plays.
You went to French school?
Yeah. Because Lebanon was a French colony.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. And my parents are French educated and didn't learn how to speak English until later on in life.
Wait, so you speak French?
Yeah, I said, ouais, je parle français. Ça y est, c'est bon. Ça y est, on refait tout en français. On
change,
change, on refait tout en français.
Amazing.
Donc, je suis arrivé au Canada en 2003.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay, right on.
Yeah, I've done comedy in French a couple of times.
Habib, how many languages do you speak?
3. Arabic, French, and English.
Okay,
I took a few years of German, but none of it
Didn't
stuck.
stick?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. One of my biggest comedy influences, and that's exactly like I think where I was getting to. One of my biggest comedy influences, I don't know if you know them, there's a French sketch group called Les Inconnus.
No. Aptly named.
Well, actually, maybe they were un peu too connus at one point.
Okay.
You know, they're a cultural staple in France for my generation at least.
Right.
It was fantastic. It was so smart and it was great. And so in English class, because I went to French school, we used to have to take English like I think 3 hours a week. And I was always more advanced than everybody else because I grew up in the States.
Right.
So I already had like my English down on lock. And they would make us memorize. We'd have to do these like, there were 2 to 3 page like dialogues in our textbook. And then you would have to go and reenact them with a classmate.
Right.
And then I think I would have been about 12 or 13 at the time. 12 maybe. Yeah, in that range. I asked the teacher if I could rewrite the dialogues just to make them more interesting for me.
More relatable.
And I started to write comedy into the dialogues. And I made them into comedy sketches. And so I think in hindsight, I always had like some level of interest.
Right.
Stand-up, I love watching and have been watching since, whatever, also maybe my early teens, if not younger. And I remember Dave Chappelle saying something about comedy, which I think holds very true, but he was like, stand-up is maybe the only like profession where you can integrate everything that you know. And it's so true. And I'd always felt very limited in every job that I've done. I'm like, there's only a small aspect of what I'm interested in. There's always a small aspect, like, and I've always been interested in connecting things and connecting ideas, especially if that connection isn't obvious. So like with the Sneaker podcast, I think the idea behind it was I want to interview people that are doing interesting things, but I want to see how their love for sneakers influenced that or affected that.
Right.
So I interviewed like a designer and I was like, how does what you learned from shoes affect like, your architecture?
Right.
Or how does this affect your music? Or how does this affect your, your way to approach like restaurants and,
life.
Life. And it led to very interesting conversations. So I was teaching at the time. I enjoyed public speaking, and I thought, hey, this could be a good fit.
Interesting. So writing, I love the distinction that you made. I never put it like that, because this shows how little I know. Comedy is such a large term.
Yeah.
And then we often, should I say, there's this notion that like stand-up is comedy, or it's just that.
Yeah.
Whereas like, as you just put it, way, way, way before you even think of getting on stage, you're telling me how you like words and you like writing and
Of course.
But we do forget that notion.
Yeah, I should say, like, I have I'm not going to say unique because I'm not the only person that approaches comedy this way. this is going to sound very odd.
Let's do this.
I find laughter to be one of the most overrated elements of stand-up comedy.
In the fact that we need to laugh?
And the fact, Cat Williams called jokes a necessary evil in stand-up because he's like, it gets in the way of what I really want to say. I need the jokes. I need to have jokes in there to keep people kind of interested and tethered and entertained. But what I really want to say comes in between the jokes. Right. And that's something that I've learned to apply to my comedy. And I'm getting more and more comfortable with, I'm secure in who I am as a comic and in what I do. So if somebody, like in my first couple of years, if somebody came to me and was like, that wasn't funny or you're not funny, it would rattle me. And I'd go back and be like, no, make it funny. And now I'm like, okay, cool. That's fine. You know, does it have to be funny? Yes, you need humor. I mean, otherwise it's a TED Talk or go write a book. You know,
otherwise it's not called stand-up comedy.
But I also can't discount the fact that the majority of the time when people come up to me to talk about something that resonated with them in the show, it's usually not a joke. It's more often something that I've said in between or something. Now that I'm doing longer sets, it's also very different when you're doing 10 minutes versus half an hour and then versus an hour. And now these shows, I mean, we said 75, a lot of them clocked in at 90.
Wow,
that's too long. That's too long.
On stage.
It is a long time to be on stage. It's a long time to hold people's attention. I think it's a little gratuitous, honestly, and a little like self-serving at one point. I think it's a very thin line between having the audience be on your side and having them turn against you. Like, okay, enough there, buddy. But it allowed me to just stay in the moment, to let the jokes breathe, and just to be able to frame things a little bit more completely and a little bit more comprehensively.
The stage is a strange place, and I've never been on stage alone.
That's what I was going to say also is comedy, at least from what I can think of, one of the very few performance arts where you're alone. I can't remember where we were. I was at a variety show over the weekend. And there was a singer, and I caught her mess up a line.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
And my friend caught it too. And I don't know how many people in the audience picked up on it. But I looked at her and was like, you know, we kind of made eye contact, both acknowledged that we witnessed that. But I told her, I was like, yo, if that was me on stage as a comic, it would have made it very awkward. There would have been like a moment of you kill the momentum of the joke. People automatically see that you tend to freeze.
Fumbled.
You're like you fumbled. Whereas with music, it keeps going.
Yeah, there is that notion that like whenever I'm performing, you're getting a unique experience in that sense, and it's part of it. And thank me later.
Yeah,
for sure. Like if I'm seeing a person with a microphone speaking and you're fucking it up. Yeah, I don't know, man. That's I can only assume that that's the one thing that us humans love about watching someone on stage. It's such a high wire like act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I often wonder if there's a part of us that wants to see the person fail and you take kind of revel in it. But yeah, comedy in that sense, man. I mean, you can't slip up. A lot of it is timing. I've spent like 3 months sometimes on jokes trying to just work on timing. Like if I have the wording right, I'm like, should this pause be like 2 beats or just a beat or 3 beats? You know, what's too long, what's too short? And it's never constant. It'll vary depending on the audience and the audience's energy also.
Right.
You know, so you kind of have to learn to adapt those things in the moment. But even as a singer, man, if you forget the lyrics to the song as a singer, you can always hum. You can always just go la 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 la, you know, and the audience is there with you.
Last time I was on stage, my fingers got numb.
Yeah.
I had never had that happen to me before. And I was like, oh, right, like...
What were you doing on stage? Were you DJing?
I was playing
or
guitar.
You were playing guitar.
Yeah. And I'm not a guitar player.
Yeah.
And I just remember this feeling of like...
Maybe that's why your fingers kicked in. It was like, we're not supposed to be doing this.
Man, I'm useless right now. I mean, I do get those nightmares, man. Like, but anyways, it's how do you? Here's a question. Here's something I really want to know from a stand-up comic.
Yeah.
Do you get nervous before going on stage?
Always, almost always. If I'm not, it's not a good sign usually. I think it's a healthy fear.
What do you do to overcome this?
I bounce around, man. I pace around a lot.
Okay. You ever feel like, fuck, I don't want to do this no more?
Yeah, there's been plenty of shows where I've been in the back and I'm like,
Yes.
I'm like,
This is it.
I'm like, I don't want to do it. I'm like, this is a terrible show. Like either the audience is weird or the setting or there's like the mic or something's off, And sometimes you get up there and you're like, this was like bad. And sometimes you get up there and, it's a lot better than you expected. And so I try to fight through it. At some point, you have to be a professional. And then I've built in like a lot of tricks for myself just to keep it interesting. I have a very different creative approach. I've just now started to write my material.
Okay.
Like I have almost 2 hours of material that lives nowhere but my head.
Really?
It doesn't exist in physical form. It might exist in bullet points like whatever, bus joke, or immigration application, like that's the extent of, and then that'll trigger. But it was very difficult coming out of the pandemic because I didn't forget the jokes, I forgot what the jokes were. So if you told me, oh, hey, the joke about you smoking weed on the bus, then I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. So I had to go back and like watch old footage and just jot down whatever. But
that makes me nervous.
That's a way for me to stay. Once the joke, and this is just psychological, I know that it's a psychological trap almost, because there is definite benefits in writing things down and having a visual map of the joke and moving things around and words and sitting with it. As you write, you sit with an idea a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I go up, I'm not freestyling. Like I do write, I just write it in my head.
Yeah, I think there's some sort of misconception about performing on stage where people think we're making shit up.
No, of course. You want to give the illusion that you are. You want to give the illusion that it's conversational. And a lot of the times I have developed the skill to just riff. So I'm able to just speak on stage so going back to that idea of like forgetting or trou de mémoire or whatever it is, if I don't write the joke, look, once a joke is written, I feel like there's almost an unspoken contract between you and the text. And then when you're on stage, you're trying to remember the text because you're this is how the joke is or how it should be. And then you're trying to remember. And that to me
removes you from the moment.
That to me is like reciting a joke. And I've learned to move away from reciting jokes and into telling jokes. You're telling a story.
Right.
And if you miss a part, that's fine. And if you allow yourself a certain level of freedom, that kind of freedom to just be loose with it, inevitably you end up going to new places as you're telling the joke because you're not so intent on going from point A to point B to point C. Now you're just like, okay, I know where the final destination is and we'll get there.
I've noticed that with questions for interviews. I used to have like such a big list of questions.
Yeah.
Man, I used to get lost in that shit.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. And so you keep a general structure, but not too tight. And then
because otherwise I'm not allowing my conversations to be their own thing.
Absolutely.
Habib, let's go a little bit back to your trajectory.
Yeah.
Let's keep going into your story. I want to dig deeper. So basically, it's my understanding that you moved around a lot and then you started doing comedy.
Yeah.
And tell me how this latest show that you have, what is this all about? How did it come to be?
I think we were talking a bit about this like off, I was going to say off camera, but before we started recording, my experience in comedy the first couple of years is that a lot of audience members would come up to me and ask me legitimate questions about my background. Are you for real from Lebanon? Do you for real have a Ph.D., this, and that? So very early on, my comedy got very personal. I talk about, also it was a coping mechanism for my breakup, like I won't lie. So my first couple of years were like literally trying to process that experience on stage.
Damn.
And then over time, that kind of is what comedy became to me. I like, that's just my personal preference, but I enjoy watching comics and then walking away feeling like I learned something about them. Right? And it doesn't have to be deep, and it doesn't just how do you see the world? How do you understand,
Connecting
your
with them.
environment, and so that's what I started doing with comedy. And then when I got fired from that job, I think that whole experience, that whole stretch of a year was maybe the most difficult year of my life in terms of losing something that I thought was going to be my legacy, right? We were working on a project on building like a community center, 100-year lease. So that was going to outlive us, and there's something very powerful about that.
Yeah.
There's something very powerful about working on a project that is going to continue, where the physical space that the project is happening in is going to outlive you.
I've never heard that.
And to lose that in the way that I lost it, and then 2 weeks later, on August 4th, so I got fired July 13th, and then August 4th, there was the blast in Beirut, where the ammonium nitrate in the port, just set off, and then that wiped out like a huge portion of the city. And so a lot of the places that I had formative memories in were just gone. Like some of my friends' houses that I'd spent like countless days and nights in, gone. So I just packed up and went to Lebanon. And then to see that on top of an economic collapse, on top of like political instability, it was just a lot. It was a lot to process. And it was the first time I think that I went back home and home was unrecognizable to me. Like I have a very like deep relationship with the concept of home. Like I don't idealize it. I know that, I think Salman Rushdie called going back home a recidivism to the known, right? That's why we call it going back home.
Wow.
And I understand that people change as much as places do. So whenever you go back, if you're trying to reconcile the new me versus the new Lebanon, there's always going to be an adjustment phase. But this was drastic. This was drastic. Like Lebanon looked different, felt different. And so when I came back here, it's the first time, like in the description you read, like a lot of time in the woods. I needed to just completely disappear. And so I tried it for 2 weeks. I rented a small cabin, no cell signal. I just went and was just like with myself and my thoughts for 2 weeks. And I was like, it felt abnormally comfortable.
Right.
And I felt like I could do it a lot longer. So over the course of the next 2 years during the pandemic, I did 3 retreats, and they kept getting longer and longer. Like the second one was 4 weeks. The one after that was 5 weeks. And I got to reflect on a lot. I really got to reflect on a lot, man, on what was this attachment to leaving a physical mark, to leaving a physical legacy, this building that we were building. Like, what was my attachment to that? How much of it is ego-driven? Even though because it's easy to say it's a community center, it's something that does good for people, and that's true. But also, I was attached to seeing it through.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I was bothered by the fact that there was a chance at the time, and now that chance does no longer exist because the project kind of fell apart. But at the time, that project was being carried forward by people that I hired.
Yeah.
And that was very difficult for me. But again, how much of that is ego? Because if you're really in it for the benefit that this project can have, then the fact that the project is moving forward is all that should count.
Right.
I need to be involved. I want to be involved. I have to have recognition or this or that. Again, ego. So I got to reflect on a lot of that, reflect on home, reflect on my place in Canada, who I wanted to be as a person, who I wanted to be as a comic.
Yeah.
And that's why coming out of the pandemic, I'm like, let's try comedy full time and let's go deeper. I want to talk about like my fears, my insecurities, my anger. I was becoming an increasingly angry person because I was watching my country fall apart. And on one level, I was helpless And on another level, I realized that the world doesn't care, man. The world does not give a fuck, because I seen like the reaction to when the cathedral, like Notre Dame,
Yeah.
the blaze, and when it burnt down.
What a big deal that was.
What a big deal that was, and how much they were able to raise in aid. They were able to raise more than they needed in less time.
Yeah.
And then I look at what's going on in Lebanon, and I'm like, there's no coverage. Like, nobody knows.
It's hard not to be angry.
I got very angry, man. And then when the Ukraine popped off, not to compare, and there's human suffering everywhere, but to see the coverage that got and the amount of sympathy and support versus like, I'm like, there's nothing about Lebanon still, huh? And I'm sure that, somebody in Africa and somebody in Latin America can say the same.
Yeah, someone's always going to be like,
somebody's always,
Yeah, but having said that, this doesn't remove you from being allowed to feel those things and to notice them.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about it anyways.
But those two losses, the professional loss and the personal loss, coming back to back and being as pronounced as they were, on some level were very liberating, comedically and artistically. Because I'm like, dude, I don't give a fuck anymore. Like, what are you going to do? This is not going to work out? Big deal.
Right.
I've lost so much. And that's not to say that my losses, again, I'm not comparing, and I don't want to, I hope I don't sound like a victim, because I'm not.
Hey, I'm asking you a question.
Yeah.
It's your life.
Yeah. No, but I don't want to be like, I'm not mopey about it. I don't feel bad. Like, I'm very grateful for everything that happened, because it led me to the point where I'm at right now.
It's certainly not coming across as mopey to me.
Yeah. So it was liberating in the sense where it helps put comedy into perspective, man, because ultimately, like, our careers are our careers, and I personally, like, will stress a lot of things, like not getting a certain opportunity, you're not getting a festival, or not getting on a show, and then I'm like, for what? Who cares? Who cares, man? Ultimately, who cares? So I still do the work, but I do the work with much more intent and focus. And I think that the time off stage, I've been doing comedy 8 years, but 2 of those years there was no comedy. Right. So 2 years off stage was very difficult at the time, in the moment. But with a little bit of distance and hindsight, I think that those 2 years helped make me a better comic.
I have no doubt.
I think that those experiences in isolation and solitude and self-reflection helped me learn more about myself. I think I had time to think about what kind of comic I wanted to be. So there's a lot of like jokes, and that's where it goes back to like laughter being overrated. I'm not going to say it's easy to make people laugh, but you find out that there are certain tropes that do actually commonly, that are easier to make people laugh with. So sex jokes hit more often than not. Very accessible and
relatable.
Relatable to an extent, but also for me at least, I want more out of comedy, man. I'd love to make people think with my comedy.
No small feat.
It's no small feat. No, not it's no small feat to make people think. Period. Let alone doing it with something that is expected to be surface level entertainment.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Because, you're going to a club, you're going to get a beer, you're with your girl, you're thinking about a couple of jokes.
Yeah.
And then you end up getting shifted.
Yeah. Let's talk about a movie. Let's talk about, a breakup. Let's talk about this, and that. Even when I do talk about a breakup, I'm going to try to talk about my inability to connect, my emotional that I'm closed off emotionally. It's going to be something that is a bit deeper, dare I say. I've had a lot of people come up to me and be like, yo, you made me look at things differently, or you made me think of things differently. And that's, to me at least, that's the compliment of the highest order. Your shit was hilarious, you made me laugh, I appreciate that very much. You made me think differently is invaluable.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's I can only assume that your age has something to do with that.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, it's as we were saying before, like, when you're 20, you may be smart, but you're just 20.
Yeah.
Now you're 43, right?
Yeah.
Undoubtedly.
I think To an extent, it's intellect, man, because I've met some very, very bright, like younger people.
No doubt.
You know,
No
so
doubt.
to an extent, it is intellect. But it is intellect, but I think it's more than that because, again, like in meeting young people that are, you know, smarter than I've met some like brilliant, like people that are borderline geniuses. But I think ultimately, there's an expression in Arabic that says al-amr ilu haq, which means that like age has its due, like its due respect, basically, or its due right. But there are things that you can only get through time. There are,
So I've
again, like
noticed.
a lot of these life experiences, like loss, just going through difficult times, learning to be resilient. I think these are things that age gives you over time, over time.
No
There
doubt.
are a lot of experiences that I know I have yet to go through that will drastically change who you are as a person. Like I think of very randomly, like the birth of a child. The birth of a child will change fundamentally who you are and how you see life. The death of a sibling or a parent, God forbid, but inevitable, unless, not to be too morbid, unless you die first. But, these are things that fundamentally change who you are. And so I think that starting comedy at a later age, having experienced some of the things that I experienced over the last couple of years, my job was... like I was around a lot of celebrities for that job. And I was never like the starstruck person, but you hang around enough famous people and you're like, these dudes are just people.
Sure.
So
Sure.
you're less impressed, These are all things that I think have helped me navigate like my surroundings just in a different way. I'm not going to say it's better. It works for me. It's a unique in a slightly different way.
What are some of the I'm not asking you to divulge any of the punches, but I'd love to get a bit more into the show. Like, what are some of the passages or some of the things that you approach in that subject a bit more specifically?
So, the show, I should admit that the show is still, quote unquote, under construction.
Okay.
Okay, so I hit a point. I started headlining clubs very early on in my comedy trajectory.
Okay.
Like I would say I was under 4 years.
Okay.
And that's like very, very early on.
Sure.
So I did that for about a year and change, and then the pandemic hit. Coming out of the pandemic, as I started to talk about like more serious issues, I started to realize that like clubs might not be the best environment for that. Again, because people are coming expecting like lighthearted
Light
entertainment, and then you're hitting them upside the head with something that, plus a lot of the clubs are in just like very Oshawa, London,
Right.
London,
Oof,
my
London,
God,
Ontario.
London, Ontario. Ooh, exactly. All the
Yes.
way up to like Thunder Bay. Like there's very odd settings. Anyway, so this show was my first attempt to build something coherent with a specific narrative. It's called Survivor's Remorse because a lot of it I wanted to deal with some of the experiences that I mentioned in terms of losing your home country, knowing that my parents are, 7 time zones away, dealing with no power, no electricity, all sorts of upheaval, where I get to be here living like a relatively normal life.
Yeah, and well off, if I may. Like
Yeah,
we're
absolutely, man.
We're laid back in Canada.
Absolutely. And so I wanted to try to piece together a coherent narrative around that. As I started to pull it together, so here's the thing, man. I was worried about the fact that, because initially also when I first started comedy, I did talk a lot about like cultural topics, cultural identity, race, immigration, that kind of thing. I did this thing once where I was hosting for a comic that I used to watch and love before starting comedy. So this was a very meaningful exchange for me.
Right.
And I did a breakup joke on stage, and I got off stage and he was like, yo, can I holler at you after the show, stick around. And he was like, that breakup joke, he was like, that's the one. He's like, that was the one that I felt you were vulnerable. I related to it. When you got off stage, I got mad because I wanted to hear more about the story.
Okay.
And then we started talking about this tension between, a responsibility that I felt to talk about like certain social issues, versus, that, because I used to back end all of that material, all the relationship stuff, all the emotional stuff. He's like, I'd love to see you flip the order. I'd love to see you open with that. I'd love to see you create a space of vulnerability and stay there for as long as you can. And then once you do that, you can say anything you want. He's like, you can get away with murder on stage, right? and we talked about the Hassan Minhaj special, the first one, and the name escapes me right now. And he was like, what's that story about? And I was like, immigration coming to America. He was like, no, it's a love story. He's like, he's chasing the girl. And I was like, oh, okay. Anyway, so I flipped the order and I started doing that. And it worked. It creates a very different, because people start to see you as a person versus seeing you as an Arab or a Lebanese person or an immigrant.
Yes.
You're introducing yourself. I guess it's very different if you're already famous and people know you, but if you're introducing yourself to an audience, it helps to introduce yourself very broadly. So I struggled, all of this to go back to the show, I struggled whether or not to include a lot of the breakup material that I had.
Right.
And I ended up opting for it. I'm like, no, I think, and part of the reason was, to create that connection and space of vulnerability. But also, in hindsight, it was the first loss. It was an emotional loss, but it was the first loss that I did not feel equipped to deal with. And so eventually, when I took a step back from the show, I started looking at it as a show around loss, right? And loss is something, if I say, hey, this is a show about Lebanon, this is very specific. If I say if I'm able to take a step back and say, this is a show about loss, this is a show about home.
Much more relatable.
It's much more relatable because, yes, you or somebody else in the audience might not come from a place that is as war-torn or, that's gone through Lebanon as challenged. But everybody's experienced loss. Yeah, everybody knows that on some level. So I managed to structure it along those lines. So it goes a bit of that relationship loss, because that's also what led me into comedy.
Right. So it's
right.
important.
Yeah. And then what I do with the comedy in terms of being able to process. And then I talk about Lebanon. I talk about going back and forth between here and there. At one point, I felt like I was on the verge of a psychotic break, man, because I go spend stretches of time there. So I'm there for 4 or 5 months in a very specific reality. Really? Yeah. And then I come back here for 5 or 6 months.
You still do this?
Yeah. Over the last 3 years, over the last 2.5 years, I've gone back 3 times, and it's been 2 months, 6 months, and 3 months. So that's almost half my time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's almost half the time. Okay. And it is very difficult, man. It is very difficult just when I go back there, just readjusting and adapting. When I come back here, I'm like, yo, things are way too normal. Like how? And what is reality and what, and how does any of that work? And that's what I try to process through the show. It's still... So I did 2 dry runs, and then I did the 3-show run, Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto. Yes. And I would say that just now I'm happy with the tone and the pacing and the overall structure. Because initially I was like, okay, this works in some aspects, but doesn't work in others. This needs to go. I think right now, if I were to tighten it up, it probably clocks in at 80 minutes. I will trim it down to 50.
Okay.
And then rewrite a new half hour for it.
Okay.
So I have a very good sense of what the points, Yeah. I'm like, okay, more on the educational aspect of me going to graduate school. Less on this, because it dilutes the pace or the,
Right.
A little bit more about Lebanon, a little bit more about why it's called survivor's remorse and some of that, So now is an interesting, like creative stretch a
Amazing.
little
This
bit.
is so interesting to
Yeah.
me, man. This is Habib, man. Thank you so much for sharing all this.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, man. Thank you for the opportunity. Really.
I know we could go on forever and
yeah,
ever, but
yeah.
I want to be respectful of everybody's time, yours, and the people who listen.
They can hit stop. You know.
Yeah, but I'm trying to keep them engaged as
No, I
long as
got
I
you.
can
I'm
before they
playing.
go.
Yeah.
Habib, when it's time to plug yourself, do you have any more gigs coming up? And I would like to also for you to give your social media handles.
Okay, so gigs coming up. It'll probably be too late by the time this drops, but July 2nd, I'm doing an extended set at here in Montreal at Omnivore
Yes.
on Saint Laurent and Rachel, give or take. Phenomenal spot. These are some of the people that I met during my time in Montreal are legitimately the most meaningful relationships I've been able to forge.
Wow.
And so that's why I'm kind of toying around with the idea of moving back.
Sheesh.
The summer's a bit quiet. July, August are going to be mostly writing, going over. Like I have about 6 to 7 hours of footage to just rewatch and edit and chop up. September, October gets a bit busier. I'm recording my first album October 14th.
Wow.
I'm recording my first. It's going to be an audio album.
Amazing.
And I'm not going to burn the entire like show, but I'd like to put out something that's anywhere between a half hour and 40 minutes.
Amazing.
So I'm doing 2 shows on October 14th at the Corner Comedy Club in Toronto.
Okay, so we still got time, but
You
you know
got
what?
plenty of time.
I'll
And
help
then-
you promote it by then.
Thank you, man.
Perfect.
And then social media, I'm most active on Instagram.
Let's just keep it to Instagram.
Yeah, so
am
it's
I.
at h.s. And that's actually spelt out like HDOTSDOT.
Perfect.
And that's where I plug most of my shows. You can find a little bit of content and YouTube channel coming soon.
Perfect. I'll make sure I'll link all of that in the description.
I appreciate that.
Habib, thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you, man.
It was
I
a
like the
pleasure.
music in the background. I kept expecting it to just end.
Well,
I thought it was intro. I thought it was intro music, and I'm like, no, this thing is rocking the whole hour.
Habib, we will be talking again very soon.
I appreciate you, man.
Have a good day, guys.
Thank you.
Fuck.
Exploding and we bringing it on. It's in the sky. We just gotta read it.